A sword dripping with the spoils of war. A longship cutting through the icy sea. That's the Viking we all think we know. But what if I told you the true measure of a Viking lord's power wasn't just the terror he caused on the battlefield? What if it was the silent authority he held from his high seat in a smoky hall? What if the greatest conquerors of the Viking age won their power not just with an axe, but with a handshake, a plot of land, and a carefully poured horn of mead? Forget the raider for a moment. We're about to uncover the real story of the Viking elite and how they truly lived. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. The Viking Age. It immediately brings some powerful images to mind, right? Fierce warriors, masters of the sea, bursting out of Scandinavia to raid, trade, and settle across Europe and beyond. Their stories, the sagas, are filled with epic battles and a serious thirst for glory. But that popular image, while not totally wrong, is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. It focuses on the action and the violence, but it overlooks the very foundation of Viking society: power, wealth, and the complex social ladder that held it all up. The people at the very top of this world, the kings and powerful nobles we know as jarls, were so much more than pirates. They were the aristocracy of the North, the 1% of their time. Their lives weren't just one raid after another, but a careful balancing act of politics, economics, and social climbing. To really get the Viking Age, we have to look past the front of the longship and into the heart of their world, the great halls, the huge estates, and the busy trade hubs they controlled. This is the story of how the Viking elite actually lived. It's a story not just of plunder, but of property, not just of fighting, but of feasting, not just of conquest, but of control. We'll explore where their immense wealth came from, which often had more to do with a good harvest than a bloody battle. We'll step inside their amazing longhouses, the centers of their political and social power, and we'll discover a world where your status was written in the fine silks you wore, the intricate jewelry that you flashed, and the lavish parties you were expected to throw. This is the untold history of the Viking conquerors, a look at the lives they led when the fighting was done, in the halls of power where legacies were truly made. First things first, to really get the Viking elite, we have to update our definition of a conqueror. The most powerful men in Norse society were the jarls, a noble class of chieftains who were second only to kings. In the early days, a guy might become a jarl through his skill in battle. But as Viking society got more complex, the role of the jarl changed from a simple war chief into a sophisticated political operator, a regional boss who was one of the real power brokers of the Viking world. These men were the lords of the land. While a king might rule over a huge, sprawling territory, it was the jarls who handled the day-to-day business of power. They ran specific regions, sometimes for a king, but often with a whole lot of independence. This setup, with power spread out, was exactly what you needed in an age of exploration and settlement. It allowed for things to actually get done locally across the massive Viking world. A jarl's power wasn't just about how many warriors he could call up for a raid. It was measured by the size of his lands, the loyalty of his people, and his influence in the community. Sure, he was a military commander who had to train and equip his own personal squad of bodyguards, known as a herd. But he was also a manager and a judge. Jarls had to keep the peace, collect taxes, and settle arguments in their territory. They even ran the local assemblies, called the Thing, which was the democratic heart of Norse society, where laws were made and justice was served. To do that, you needed more than just muscle. You needed wisdom and a deep knowledge of Norse law. So, The most successful Jarl wasn't always the most brutal raider. He was the most strategic leader. He was a politician, navigating a messy web of alliances and rivalries. He was an economic powerhouse, and he was a pillar of the community who understood that real power wasn't just built on fear, but on generosity, honor, and respect. Being good at fighting was definitely part of the job description, but it was just one tool in a much bigger toolbox. The real conqueror was the one who could win a battle, but also manage a farm, seal a trade deal, and command loyalty long after the swords were put away. The real source of wealth and status in the Viking world wasn't a chest full of silver. It was the ground beneath their feet. Land ownership was everything. A Jarl's influence was directly tied to how big and how productive his farms were. The richest lords owned huge areas of land, sometimes dozens of farms that were all worked by other people. These lands produced a steady flow of everything from grain and cattle to timber and iron, and that was the economic engine that paid for their fancy lifestyles and political games. Most Vikings were free farmers called carls who worked their own land, but many others were basically tenants on a Jarl's estate. They worked the land and paid him in food and goods. This system created a very clear social pyramid, with the landowners at the top, supported by the work of everyone else. At the very bottom were the thralls, or slaves, often captured in raids or just people who fell into debt. Thralls did the hardest labor on the farms and had no rights at all. So, a Jarl's life was deeply tied to the rhythm of the seasons. While they were off leading raids or playing politics, a huge part of their job was just making sure their lands were well managed. They needed good harvests, healthy livestock, and a steady production of resources. A successful lord was a prosperous lord because that wealth translated directly into power. It meant he could feed his huge household and his warriors, have extra to sell, and throw the huge parties that were so important for his reputation. This connection to the land was more than just business. It was about identity and legacy. A Jarl's estate was his kingdom in miniature, a physical symbol of his power. We often imagine Vikings as constantly at sea, but for the elite, life was rooted in the soil of their homeland. They weren't nomads, they were landlords. The loot from a raid might fill a treasure chest for a season, but the steady wealth from a well-run estate could keep a family in power for generations. While land was the stable foundation of a Jarl's power, the elite didn't put all their eggs in one basket. They actively grew their income through a smart mix of trade, tribute, and, of course, plunder. The Viking Age was a time of incredible economic energy, and the elite were sitting right in the middle of it, controlling how goods and wealth moved across huge distances. Viking merchants were some of the best of their time, and powerful jarls and kings often controlled the most important trading towns and routes. Their amazing longships could handle both the open ocean and shallow rivers, which let them build trade networks that stretched from North America all the way to the Middle East. They sailed down the rivers of Russia to connect with the Byzantine Empire and the rich caliphates of the Arab world. From the north, they shipped out valuable stuff like high-quality furs, timber, honey, amber, and walrus ivory. And in return, they brought back the luxury goods that were the ultimate status symbols for the elite. We're talking fine wine from Germany, glassware from France, and exotic treasures like shimmering silks from China and Byzantium, gems from India, and massive amounts of silver coins from the Arab world. The fact that thousands of Arab coins have been found in buried hoards across Scandinavia tells you everything you need to know about how profitable this trade was. Tribute, or taxes, was another big income stream. Jarls and kings collected payments from the people living on their lands, which guaranteed a steady flow of resources. This system cemented their authority and gave them the money to pay for their soldiers and run their territories. And then there was raiding. The popular image of Vikings sacking monasteries is definitely based in reality. These raids were a direct and brutally effective way to get rich quick, especially when it came to precious metals, weapons, and slaves. For a young warrior, a successful raid was one of the best ways to build your own wealth and reputation. A leader who brought his men home loaded with loot would see his influence skyrocket. But it's better to see raiding as just one part of a larger economic plan. The shrewdest leaders understood that real, long-term wealth came from a combination of all three: the steady income from land and taxes, the big profits from trade, and the high-risk, high-reward jackpots from raiding. The heart of a Viking lord's world was his home, the Great Longhouse. These weren't just houses, they were giant billboards advertising your power, wealth, and social status. They were the center of political, social, and family life. The size of your longhouse was a direct reflection of your standing. An average family might live in a house that was 15 to 50 feet long, but the halls of powerful jarls, they could stretch for over 250 feet, completely dominating the landscape. Built mostly from timber, with walls of wood, turf, or stone, these long buildings were masterpieces of Norse engineering. They had these signature curved roofs, kind of like an overturned boat, that were designed to handle fierce winds and heavy snow. Inside, the huge open central hall was the main event. A long rectangular fire pit ran right down the middle, providing light, warmth, and the place for all the cooking. Smoke just found its way out through a hole in the roof. This central hall was where everything happened. It's where the Lord, his family, and his personal bodyguard of warriors, the herd, all gathered. Benches lined the walls, used for sitting during the day and sleeping at night. The most important people, of course, got the best seats. The Jarl himself would hold court from a high seat, a throne-like chair that was a clear symbol of his authority. From there, he'd entertain guests, hold meetings, and settle arguments. For the elite, the Longhouse was a crowded, bustling place, home to not just the immediate family, but also their warriors, servants, craftsmen, and any visitors who might be passing through. And in many of the biggest longhouses, one end was even walled off to shelter valuable livestock during the winter, a practical design that also used the animals' body heat to help warm the place up. But more than just a home, the longhouse was a public stage. This is where political alliances were sealed, war strategies were planned, and justice was handed out. It was a workshop where all sorts of crafts took place, especially during the long, dark winters. And most importantly, it was the venue for the grand feasts that a lord's reputation was built on. The Longhouse was a symbol of the Jarl's power to protect and provide for his people, a place of community that stood as a giant monument to his success. Inside that smoky longhouse, no event was more important than the feast. These were not just big meals, they were powerful political events that were absolutely essential to how Viking society worked. Throwing a great party was one of the best ways for a lord to show off his wealth and generosity, two things that were cornerstones of his honor and authority. If you could provide tons of food and drink for your followers, it was a clear sign that you were a successful leader. Feasts could be held for all sorts of reasons: to celebrate a successful raid, a wedding, a religious festival like Yule in the winter, or just to strengthen the bonds between a chieftain and his people. These parties could go on for days. The long tables would be piled high with food that was way better than the everyday stuff. Roasted and boiled meats were the main attraction, with pork being a special favorite, along with beef, lamb, and game like deer and wild boar. There was plenty of fish, and vegetables like cabbage and onions were served on the side. Of course, a key part of any good feast was drinking. A lot of drinking. Ale was the common beverage, but the real prestige drink was mead, a strong wine made from honey. Drinks were served in fancy horns or cups, and the act of toasting, known as the sumbel, was a serious ritual. Toasts were made to the gods, to the memory of famous ancestors, and to the health of the Jarl. This was also the time for making big promises, bragging about your accomplishments, and declaring your loyalty. The feast was also where you got your entertainment. Professional poets, called skalds, would recite epic poems about heroes and the great deeds of their host, basically acting as a living history lesson and a PR agent all in one. There was music, storytelling, and games, all creating a lively atmosphere that brought the community together. Even where you sat was a map of the social order. The most honored guests sat closest to the Jarl, while people of lower status were further down the hall. A feast was like Viking society in miniature, a place where power was put on display, loyalties were locked in, and the community came together under the roof of their leader. It was politics with a full belly and a raised drinking horn. In a society with a very clear pecking order, showing off your wealth and status was incredibly important. For the Viking elite, your clothes, jewelry, and weapons weren't just functional. They were a way of telling everyone around you who you were and where you stood. You could spot the difference between a jarl and a regular farmer from a distance. While a common farmer wore practical, plain-colored wool, the elite could afford finer fabrics and bright colors. Dyes were expensive, so colorful clothing was a clear sign of wealth. Blue and red were especially popular. The richest of the rich could even get their hands on silk, an unbelievably precious material imported from places as far away as China, which they would use for trim or hats. Fancy embroidery and woven patterns also made the clothes of the rich stand out. Jewelry was maybe the most powerful status symbol for both men and women. They wore it proudly, often in layers, and it was made from bronze, silver, and gold. High-status men and women wore ornate brooches to fasten their cloaks, with the size and material shouting out their wealth. Arm rings and necklaces were a huge deal, often made of heavy, twisted silver or gold. They weren't just decoration. They were a form of wearable money. A jarl could reward a loyal warrior by giving him an arm ring, or even by literally hacking a piece off a larger one. Elite women wore incredible jewelry that showed off their family's wealth and their own power in the household. Strings of colorful glass beads, amber, and precious stones were common. A pair of large oval brooches were a signature piece of a high-status woman's outfit, used to pin the straps of her dress. And finally, a warrior's weapons were also a billboard for his status. While most Vikings had an axe or a spear, only the wealthy could afford a finely made sword. These swords were often status symbols in themselves, with handles beautifully inlaid with silver and copper. They were passed down through generations or given as gifts of high honor. From the color of their clothes to the weight of the silver on their arms, the Viking elite made sure their power was always on display. The children of Viking jarls weren't left to have a normal childhood. From a very young age, they were groomed for a life of leadership and responsibility. Their upbringing was basically a training program designed to give them all the skills they'd need to keep their family on top in a very competitive world. For boys, military training was everything. They learned to ride horses, handle a sword and shield, and fight as a team. This wasn't just about self-defense. It was about preparing them to lead men in battle, a basic job requirement for any future chieftain. They learned strategy and tactics, not just from drills, but from listening to the stories of their fathers and the skalds, who told tales of great battles and heroes. But it wasn't all about fighting. An elite son also had to learn how to govern. This meant understanding Norse law so he could run the local thing assembly, settle arguments fairly, and manage the resources of a huge estate. They were taught how to play the dangerous game of politics, making alliances with other powerful families and securing their spot through both strength and smart negotiating. While they didn't have schools, literacy in the form of reading and carving runes was an important skill. Strategic thinking was sharpened through board games like Hnefatafl, a game of tactics that was like a Viking version of chess. The education of elite girls was also very specialized. They learned all the skills needed to run a huge and complicated household, which was a kingdom in itself. But their education also included politics and property. They needed to understand inheritance laws and how to manage the estate, because they'd often be left in complete charge for months or even years while their husbands were off trading or raiding. A good marriage was a cornerstone of political strategy, and an elite woman was expected to be a capable and influential partner. For the children of the elite, their entire childhood was preparation for the high-stakes game of power they were born into. Despite the stereotypes of a male-dominated warrior society, women of the Viking elite held a surprising amount of power. While men held the formal titles of command, high-status women had a degree of freedom and authority that was pretty amazing for the time. They were not passive figures stuck in the home. They were matriarchs, landowners, and strategic partners who were absolutely vital to the success of their families. The main domain of an elite woman was the great longhouse and the estate. She was the husfreyja, the lady of the house, and that title came with real authority. The keys she wore hanging from her belt weren't just for show. They were a powerful symbol of her control over the household's valuables, including the locked chests of food, textiles, and silver. When her husband was away, which could be for months or years at a time, she took over complete management of the entire estate, and that was a huge job. It meant overseeing the farm, managing servants and slaves, and making sure the entire community survived and thrived. Viking women also had significant legal rights, much more than women in many other parts of Europe. They could own property, inherit land and wealth, and even run their own businesses. And critically, they had the right to divorce. A woman could decide to end a marriage and take back her dowry and any property she brought into it, giving her a level of financial independence that was exceptionally rare. These women were also key players in the political games of the elite. As mothers, they raised future leaders. As wives, they were often trusted advisors. Their marriages were frequently strategic alliances between powerful families, and their ability to keep the peace and mediate arguments was highly valued. The famous Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking graves ever found, held the remains of two high-status women. They were buried with unbelievable wealth, including a magnificent ship and luxury goods, which is a clear sign of the power and prestige they held in life. The women of the Viking elite weren't just behind the throne, they were often the very foundation it was built on. Life at the top of Viking society came with incredible perks, but it was also a life on a knife's edge. It was full of danger, pressure, and huge responsibilities. The power and wealth of a jarl weren't guaranteed. They had to be constantly defended and maintained. Central to a leader's life was the idea of honor, or doma. This was basically your reputation and the legacy you would leave behind. Protecting your honor was job number one. An insult couldn't be ignored, and a challenge had to be met. This often led to violent blood feuds between families, which were a necessary part of a social code where your reputation was everything. A leader who looked weak would quickly lose the respect of his own men. The political world was treacherous. A jarl was constantly maneuvering, balancing his loyalty to a king with his own ambitions and his rivalries with his neighbors. Alliances were fragile and could change overnight. A lord had to be a smart diplomat, good at making friends through gifts and parties, but also a ruthless strategist, ready to jump on a rival's weakness. Power struggles were common, and a jarl who let his guard down could lose everything. And leading your men in battle wasn't a job you could delegate. A jarl was expected to be on the front lines with his warriors. This was how he proved his courage and rewarded his followers with loot. A big win would cement his authority, but a major defeat could be a disaster, costing him not just land and wealth, but the loyalty of the very men sworn to protect him. Finally, there was the constant pressure to provide for his people. A jarl's followers expected to be well rewarded for their loyalty. This meant good food, plenty of drink, nice clothes, and a share of any treasure. Generosity wasn't just a nice to have, it was a political necessity. A lord who was seen as stingy or whose lands weren't doing well would find his warriors drifting off to serve a more successful and generous leader. The life of a Viking conqueror was a precarious balancing act. The high seat was a place of great honor, but it was never a place of rest. So, the world of the Viking elite was a far cry from the simple picture of axe-wielding barbarians. The great conquerors of the Norse world, the powerful jarls and kings, were complex people playing a sophisticated game of power, and that game was played in the feasting hall just as often as it was on the battlefield. Their lives show us that real, lasting power is built not just on force, but on a foundation of wealth, strategy, and social influence. Their incredible riches came from a smart, diverse portfolio. The steady, generational wealth from their huge farms, the globe-spanning profits of trade that brought silks and silver to their homes, and the brutal, high-stakes jackpots from raiding. This wealth was put on display for everyone to see in their colorful clothes, their heavy gold and silver jewelry, and most of all, in the sheer size of their longhouses. These incredible halls were the center of their universe, the headquarters of political power, the hub of social life, and the stage where they performed their authority every single day through huge feasts and strategic generosity. Life for the elite was a demanding balancing act. It required the skill to lead warriors into a shield wall, but also the brains to manage a massive farm. It demanded the cunning to navigate a web of shaky alliances and the constant need to defend one's honor in a world that valued reputation above all else. By looking beyond the longship and into the longhouse, we find a much richer, more interesting story. It's a story of shrewd politicians, strategic landlords, and global traders who understood that power had many sides. The legacy of the Viking conquerors isn't just written in the stories of the lands they raided. It's also found in the remains of their grand halls, the foreign coins buried in their soil, and the epic sagas that tell of a society built on a complex dance of wealth, honor, and power. If you found this look into the hidden world of the Viking elite interesting, do us a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. What part of the elite Viking life surprised you the most? Let us know down in the comments. We really do read all of them.